Hello, I'm John Paul, and welcome to Revelations in Grace. We're continuing our series on the end times, and specifically, we're going to be continuing to identify the symbols and characters mentioned in the book of Revelation. Revelation contained a prophecy of events that were about to take place, as it says in the first couple verses, that time was at hand, these events that were about to take place in quickness. Well, Revelation is a book written in symbols and communicated in apocalyptic imagery. And we need to discuss and interpret the book of Revelation in that manner and identify which characters it represented. And since the time context places these events in the time of John's writing, then we need to be looking in his time to find who these characters represented. We believe that Revelation was written somewhere in the early 60s AD, probably 62 to 64, according to Ed Stevens in his book, The Final Decade. So we're going to be looking for events and characters that were existing at that time in the first century. So I hope you enjoy this series, and today we're going to be discussing the sea beast and Revelation. Revelation 13 is a chapter that begins by discussing two beasts. It discusses a sea beast and a land beast following, and today we're going to be focusing on the sea beast. I'm going to read the passage and what it tells us about this beast, and we're going to look at a couple other passages in the Bible that also talk about this beast. So in Revelation 13, verses 1 through 8, and keep in mind, this is in a context where the previous chapter talked about Satan being called a dragon, a great dragon. So we have a red dragon in chapter 12, and then in Revelation, we hear about the sea beast, and we hear that the dragon gives his authority to the sea beast. So here we are talking about it. Then I stood up on the sand of the sea. I saw a beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. On his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads blasphemous names. The beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. One of his heads looked like it had been wounded fatally. His fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled at the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" A mouth speaking great things and blasphemy was given to him. Authority to make war for 42 months was given to him. He opened his mouth for blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. It was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been killed. So this is what Revelation 13 tells us about this sea beast, or the Leviathan according to history, which had 7 heads. Revelation 17 adds a couple additional clues. The angel is talking to John, and he tells him to interpret these 7 heads as 7 hills and 7 kings. And so we learn that this beast isn't a literal beast. It instead represents an empire that's built on 7 hills and has 7 kings. And he says 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue for a little while. If you recall from your history books, Rome is the empire built on 7 hills. Here are the 7 hills of Rome. So you might remember that from your history. And in fact, Rome, the empire, has some powerful correlations with this prophecy, where I think it is in fact what this symbol was describing. And in fact, the 7 kings, the 7 heads that of this beast, would be the 7 Roman emperors, starting with Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius. Nero would be the 6th, who was reigning at the time that Revelation was written, and the 7th would be Galba. Now, this beast is described as coming out of the sea. Let me see where it was. Okay. He stood on the sand of the sea. I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. Well, Revelation tells us what this means. In Revelation 17:15, the angel tells John, the waters that you saw, or the seas that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. In the book of Revelation, Israel is depicted as the land, and the foreign nations that come to attack her are known as the sea, the foreign people from outside of Jerusalem. And this continues in the tradition of Daniel the prophet. Daniel prophesied about 4 great beasts coming out of the sea, different from one another, and they represented 4 empires that attacked Jerusalem in the past: Babylon, Media Persia, Greece, and finally Rome. And so these beasts come out of the sea because they were the empire surrounding Israel, who was the land. Um, and these heads had blasphemous names on their heads. Well, the Roman empires, they wanted to be worshipped as gods. They called themselves gods. They said blasphemous things, and they forced their empire to worship their gods and idols. And that's how they also made the world worship the dragon. Let me see if I can find it here. Yep, they worship the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like this beast? Who is able to make war with him?" If you recall from Roman history, Rome had conquered almost every empire that stood against it. It owned much of the known world at that time. And in fact, in Josephus, War of the Jews, let me find where this guy's name is. Roman King Agrippa, he attempted to persuade the Jews to avoid war with Rome, illustrating how the Roman Empire decimated all empires that stood against it. And that day, Rome was considered unconquerable. And that's what this passage in Revelation 13 is depicting. So we have the 7 heads of the Caesars, and this correlates with the 7 heads. Now, after the death of Galba, who was the 7th emperor, and the rise of Vespasian and Titus, they reigned as joint Caesars. There were 2 other Caesars who were named Otho and Vitellius, but the Romans didn't consider them to be legitimate. In fact, I made a correction to my book where I said that even Galba didn't count as a Caesar, but now I realize that Galba did count, and Otho and Vitellius did not. For instance, in Cassius Dio, who was an early Roman historian, he writes how Galba had been voted into imperial power by the Senate, and even how Vespasian and Titus acknowledged their authority. However, later Otho killed Galba a few months after he took his seat. And he did this when the soldiers, they cut off the heads of their victims, and they carried them to Otho in the camp and also into the Senate house. And the senators, though terror-stricken, affected to be glad. And the Senate, however, voted to Otho all the privileges pertaining to the sovereignty. So these senators were basically threatened. They were worried that these soldiers were going to kill them, just like they killed Galbus. And that's why they voted for Otho. And later, Cassius Dio makes this more clear when he describes how Otho withdrew from a battle with Vitellius, declaring that he could not witness a battle between kindred. And he adds, just as if he had become emperor in some legitimate fashion. So Cassius Dio didn't consider the emperorship of Otho to be legitimate. And later, at the end of his life, he talks about how, thus, after living most disgracefully of all men, he, that is Otho, died most nobly, and though he had seized the empire by a most villainous deed, his taking leave of it was most honorable. So Otho wasn't considered legitimate. He had seized it by a villainous deed. He had become emperor in an illegitimate fashion. And the same can be said of Vitellius. Vitellius wasn't voted into power. He just killed Otho and assumed his throne. And we hear about that. Let's see here. We learn about that here in Cassius Dio, book 65, section 1. And then later, he characterizes the rebellion of Vitellius and Otho, and this could be referring to their battle, but it could also be referring to their reigns, that their reigns were not considered legitimate, but a rebellion. And this is Vespasian and how he heard this. So all that to be said, there were 7 emperors reigning from Julius all the way to Galba, Galba being the 7th. And then after them, there were 2 illegitimate emperors, Otho and Vitellius, and they both reigned very shortly. And during this time of history, Rome was in a tremendous civil war where people thought the empire was going to end. They thought it was the end of the Roman Empire, and it was a very dark period in Roman history. And it wasn't resolved until the joint reign of Vespasian and Titus came and brought back peace to the empire. And we're going to be discussing this and how it's connected with the symbolism of the beast. So, so I'll jump into that in just a second. But first, we're going to discuss how this beast symbolized and represented, it resembles a leopard and a bear and a lion, because Daniel uses the same imagery. He talks about how he sees four empires in Israel's past: the Babylon and Persia and Media Persia and Greece, and they're represented by the lion, the bear, and the leopard in the same way. And you learn about that, like, the goat is the king of Greece. So these empires were represented by animals. So the fact that the sea beast resembles these different beasts shows that it had ownership over them. It had conquered their lands. It had adopted their cultures and their religions. So when Rome took over Greece and Persia and the land of Babylon, I mean, it owned the whole empire, but it incorporated some of their gods and their cultures and their religions into its own culture. And that's why it resembled these beasts. But in a more physical sense, we see that the Roman legions and their standard bearers even wore skins of lions, leopards, and bears. So someone on the battlefield seeing these soldiers would see them resembling, in fact, these three creatures, just as Revelation 13 says. That's so amazing. Well, going back to what I was saying earlier, we learn in Revelation 13:3 that one of the heads of the sea beast is said to have a mortal wound, but he is healed, causing amazement and followership. And this can be associated with Nero. Nero was the sixth Caesar, and he was reigning during the time that Revelation was written. And he inflicted a mortal wound upon himself when he stabbed his throat with a dagger. He caused his own suicide. And this led to a dark period of civil war and uncertainty in Rome. Revelation 16:10 tells us, "And the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness." This was a picture of what happened when Nero committed suicide and Rome was thrown into that dark civil war. Well, that dark civil war was resolved and peace was reestablished when Vespasian and Titus came to the throne as joint Caesars. So Vespasian was the father and Titus was the son, and they agreed to reign jointly. Vespasian and Titus were welcomed as joint Caesars in Rome. They were loved by the people, and it resolved all of the conflict that they had been having, and they rescued them from that period. Well, this resembles also the legend of Hercules. In the legend of Hercules, we learn about this Hydra or Leviathan or sea beast. And what we learn from this story, and this was an ancient story that John's audience would have been familiar with. In that story of Hercules, we have the fact that when Hercules cuts off the heads of the sea beast, or a head of the sea beast, two grow in its place. You might even remember that from the Marvel series about the Hydra villains and how they say, you cut off one head and two grow in its place. They get that from the legend of Hercules. And that was around even at the time that Revelation was written. And so this is depicted in the fact that Nero cut off his head. He severed his head metaphorically by stabbing himself in the throat with a knife. And two emperors rose out of that severed head, Vespasian and Titus, as those joint Caesars. And that's what rescued Rome from that period of civil war. And that was the revival, the resurrection of the beast that caused amazement and followership. And as I discussed earlier, the Romans forced their people to worship their gods and idols, and they even proclaimed themselves as gods and said blasphemous things to God, and they were unconquerable. No one was able to stand up against them. Not only that, but Rome persecuted Christians for a period of 42 months. And we learn about this in, let's see here. What happened is Nero might have caused a fire in Rome. There was a massive fire that burned down a lot of Rome, and people were really mad at Nero. And Nero was incentivized to blame the fire on the Christians. And this fire occurred in 64 AD. Well, that began a massive time of persecution against Christians empire-wide. They were tortured and hunted down and treated brutally during that period. And that period of persecution didn't end until Nero's death in June of 68 AD. That period lasted just around 3.5 years, or 42 months, in fulfillment of this prophecy, how the beast was given authority to make war with the saints for 42 months and conquer them. And it was a horrible time in history, one of the worst persecutions, and maybe the very worst persecutions against Christians in the past. And this attack on Christians was seen as an attack on Christ himself. In Matthew 25, Jesus told his disciples, "As you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me." And he's saying that when you treat my children poorly, you're treating me poorly. And we see this depicted in Revelation 19, where we see the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies representing Rome making war against him who is seated on the horse and against his army. That is Jesus. The Romans were making war against Jesus by persecuting these Christians for these 42 months. If we read in Revelation 17, 8 through 11, here we go. In Revelation 17, we learn that this sea beast was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go into destruction. And we learn that 5 of these heads have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue for a little while. The beast that was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is of the 7, and he goes into destruction. And so what the symbolism means, because it seems contradictory, this beast is and was, but also is not. So what does that mean? Well, this beast did exist in Israel's past. It was in the sense that it represented significant enemies of God's people in past persecutions. For instance, in Ezekiel 29, Egypt or Pharaoh is described as a great dragon that lies in the midst of the streams. And in Jeremiah 51, we learn that Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar is described as a monster who is persecuting Israel. Well, and likewise, this end times beast follows the tradition, and it follows this symbol of the enemies of God's people who persecute God's people. And so that's how it was. And it was not in the sense that it was not yet attacking the temple and destroying the temple. It had not yet started or persecuting Christians. And it is in the sense that it's, as Romans 17 says here, the one is in the sense of the 6th head. Nero was reigning at the time that Revelation was written. So it is, but it hadn't yet come to attack Israel or the Christians in fulfillment of its role in the past as enemies of God's people. So that's the sense in which it is and was and is not. We also learned that there is an 8th king associated with this beast, which I identify as the joint reign of Vespasian and Titus. And they fulfill the archetype of the enemy of God's people. And they desecrated the Jewish temple, similar to Antiochus Epiphanes in the past. More than 100 years before Christ came onto the scene, there was a Greek ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he committed atrocities in Jerusalem and the temple and forced them not to be able to do their sacrifices, and he ended up doing great damage to the temple and to the Jewish religion. And what was going to happen was Titus, under the orders of Vespasian, was going to come and do the same to Jerusalem in the 1st century. That's another sense in which the beast was in the past. Israel would have known, oh yes, we've seen this kind of person before. We've seen this beast before. Now we're going to discuss a couple tangential issues. We have an association between the 8th king and the beast who kills the two witnesses in Revelation 11. So in Revelation 11, we hear about two witnesses who are prophesying throughout the siege. Um, let me go ahead and open that up. Revelation 11. And God gives his authority to two witnesses, and they prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And it tells about the miraculous things they do. And finally, it talks about, let's see here. Okay, in verse 7, it says, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes out of the abyss will make war with them and will overcome and kill them. So these two witnesses were going to be killed by the beast that comes out of the abyss. Well, we learned in chapter 17 that the eighth king is the king that comes out of the abyss. So that was Titus, and he was going to kill these two witnesses. Well, these two witnesses actually seem to point to a singular individual, Jesus ben Ananus, and we learn about him in Josephus' War of the Jews. I'm in Josephus, book 6, chapter 5, and I'm in section 3. And this is a part in the story where the temple is falling, and Josephus is mourning the events that have befallen them, and he is describing how the Israelites ignored all the calamitous signs that had preceded the war that would have told that this was going to happen, and they were so ignorant. And he describes all these miraculous events, especially a lot of events that occurred around Passover in 66 AD. And in particular, he describes this man named Jesus ben Ananus. And I'm going to read from what he says, and we're going to learn about this figure. He says, but what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in a very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast whereon it is our custom for every one to make tabernacles to God in the temple. He began on a sudden to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, a voice against this whole people. This was his cry, as he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet did not he either say anything for himself, or anything peculiar to those that chastise him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing as the case proved to be, that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip his answer was, Woe, woe to Jerusalem! And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him who he was, and whence he came, and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, till Albinus took him to be a madman, and dismissed him. Now during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so. But he every day uttered these lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow, Woe, woe to Jerusalem! Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food. But this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired therewithin, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. For as he was going round upon the wall, he cried out in his utmost voice, Woe, woe to the city, again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added at the last, Woe, woe, to myself also, there came a stone out of one of the engines, and smote him, and killed him immediately. And as he was uttering the same presages, he gave up the ghost. And this is talking about how this Jesus ben Ananus was on top of the wall in Jerusalem when a catapult flung a rock and it smashed this prophet. And that catapult was under the orders of Titus. Titus was conducting the siege at this time. And that would have nicely fulfilled the passage where it talks about the beast that comes out of the abyss, or Titus, makes war against the prophet, overcomes, and kills them. Now, if you've been following along, you're wondering, wait, doesn't the Bible say there's two witnesses? Why are we saying there's just one? And I don't have a great answer for this. It is worth noting, though, that Revelation 11:8, if you read it in the Greek, the language is kind of interesting. It says, and their body will be upon the street of the great city, which is symbolically or spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And it uses that term singular. If we look in the Greek, we see, and the body of them will be upon the street. Now, this could be referring to each of them having their own body. But another way, it's kind of ambiguous. You could also interpret it as them sharing a body. And that's in the singular tense. That's why I have my mouse over here. But in a couple places in the Bible, men operated in the spirit or a manner of a prominent prophet. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. Elisha received a double portion of Elijah's spirit. So perhaps the spirits or manner of two prominent prophets were sharing the body of Jesus ben Ananus. I don't know if that's right. There might be a better explanation. I'd have to do more research to find out, but I ask you to do your own research on this. And of course, with everything I've said in this video, and especially this, pray about the content I'm sharing and do your own research. But yeah, so that's just one possibility of who these two witnesses could have exemplified. And he, in fact, was killed by the 8th king of the sea beast, which would have been Titus during the siege. So that seems to be a powerful connection. Also, if we look in Revelation 9, we learn about this star that falls from the sky, and it falls to the earth, and it's given a key to the pit of the abyss. And out of that pit, we see some locusts coming up out of the abyss, and they're not allowed to harm the Christians, but they're allowed to torment those without God's mark for 5 months. And we learn that this fallen star is, in fact, his name is Apollyon, or Abaddon in Hebrew. And this is interesting because we hear that this Apollyon brings these locusts out of the abyss. Well, the 8th king in Revelation 17 also comes out of the abyss. So maybe these two figures are connected. And this seems to fit nicely with history. Titus, in fact, led the Roman legion Legio 15 Apollinarius, which in English means Apollo's 15th legion. So Titus led this Roman legion, and for 5 months he besieged Jerusalem. It started in Passover of 70 AD, and 5 months later it destroyed the temple, but it wasn't conquering the city until those 5 months ended. So that is incredible, because we have these locusts in Revelation 9 are described in the way you might describe soldiers. They have golden crowns. They look like people's faces and women's hair. They had breastplates of iron. They sounded like chariots, like many horses rushing to war. They had tails like scorpions and stings. If we understand that Revelation is written in symbols and apocalyptic imagery, why couldn't these locusts be representing the Roman legions, the Roman armies, especially since it uses a lot of things you would associate with those legions? And the fact that they siege but don't kill for 5 months seems to point to Titus' siege of Jerusalem. That's powerful. And Apollyon, the Roman god Apollyon, considered locusts sacred creatures. And that was what Titus's legion was, the legion of Apollos. So there seems to be a powerful connection there if you've been wondering about that. Well, the sea beast is eventually thrown into the lake of fire. We learn about that in Revelation 19:20. The beast is captured and the false prophet, and they're thrown alive into the lake of fire. The lake of fire was a picture of the afterlife punishment that awaited the enemies of Christ. It symbolized divine punishment against God's enemies. And it was also a spiritual afterlife place. Recall that Satan was also cast into the lake of fire. But the sense in which Rome was thrown alive into the lake of fire occurred in 79 AD when Mount Vesuvius erupted and instantly destroyed two entire coastline cities of Rome while the populace was inside. And all these people in these cities had instantaneous deaths caused by the searing pyroclastic surge, and it left petrified human cavities in the ash, which preserve their form and expressions to this day. You can read about that. I have a couple links in this article if you want to read about that. It's pretty incredible and sad. And then also, we learned that Satan was thrown into the lake of fire. Well, interestingly, a year after Mount Vesuvius erupted, a massive fire spread through Rome and destroyed all of the satanic temples in Rome, or at least most of the satanic temples. I think it was all. It's a little unclear how many were destroyed. But I want to read what Cassius Dio says about this volcanic activity because it is really phenomenal, and it paints a picture of how powerful this event was. And I apologize if I have difficulty reading this passage. It's in Old English, and it has some difficult terms to pronounce. So, so give me grace here. I'm gonna drink again. I'm in Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 66, Section 22. He writes, such as Vesuvius, and these phenomena usually occur there every year, but all the other occurrences that had taken place there in the course of time, however notable, because unusual, they may have seemed to those who on each occasion observed them, nevertheless would be regarded as trivial in comparison with what now happened, even if all had been combined into one. This is what befell. Numbers of huge men, quite surpassing any human stature, such creatures in fact as the giants are pictured to have been, appeared, now on the mountain, now in the surrounding country, and again in the cities, wandering over the earth day and night, and flitting through the air. After this, fearful droughts and sudden and violent earthquakes occurred, so that the whole plain round about seethed, and the summits leaped into the air. There were frequent rumblings, some of them subterranean, that resembled thunder, and some on the surface that sounded like bellowings. The sea also joined in the roar, and the sky re-echoed it. Then suddenly a portentous crash was heard, as if the mountains were tumbling in ruins, and first huge stones were hurled aloft, rising as high as the very summits. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke, so that the whole atmosphere was obscured, and the sun was entirely hidden, as if eclipsed. Thus day was turned into night, and light into darkness. Some thought that the giants were rising again in revolt, for at this time also many of their forms could be discerned in the smoke, and moreover a sound as of trumpets was heard. That's interesting, a sound as of trumpets was heard. While others believed that the whole universe was being resolved into chaos or fire. Therefore they fled, some from the houses into the streets, others from outside into the houses, now from the sea to the land, and now from the land to the sea. For in their excitement they regarded any place where they were not as safer than where they were. While this was going on, an inconceivable quantity of ashes was blown out, which covered both sea and land and filled all the air. It wrought much injury of various kinds as chance befell, to men and farms and cattle, and in particular it destroyed all fish and birds. Furthermore, it buried two entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii, the latter place while its populace was seated in the theater. Indeed, the amount of dust taken altogether was so great that some of it reached Africa and Syria and Egypt, and it also reached Rome, filling the air overhead and darkening the sun. There, too, no little fear was occasioned. That lasted for several days, since people did not know or could not imagine what had happened, but like those close at hand, believed that the whole world was being turned upside down, that the sun was disappearing into the earth, and that the earth was being lifted into the sky. These ashes now did the Romans no great harm at the time, though later they brought a terrible pestilence upon them. What a powerful event in history. We see that the giants are rising. We hear the sound of trumpets. We see that everyone's thinking the world's ending. The sun's being blotted out. It destroys all fish and birds. The cattle are being destroyed. There's a terrible pestilence following it. This is a massive event. And then in the following year, we learn that a fire breaks out in Rome and destroys most or all the satanic temples. And we're going to read what Castillo says about this. He writes, however, a second conflagration, which that means fire, above ground in the following year spread over very large sections of Rome while Titus was absent in Campania attending to the catastrophe that had befallen that region. It consumed the temple of Serapis, the temple of Isis, the Septa, the temple of Neptune, the baths of Agrippa, the Pantheon, the Derivatorium, the theater of Balbus, the stage building of Pompey's theater, the Octavian buildings together with their books, and the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus with their surrounding temples. Hence the disaster, check this out, hence the disaster seemed not to be of human, but of divine origin. For anyone can estimate from the list of buildings that I have given how many others must have been destroyed. So the Romans, this fire was so catastrophic and destroyed so many of their temples that they believed that this fire was actually caused by God himself. And this seems to fulfill the idea that Satan was thrown into the lake of fire, that his temples, his satanic temples, were burned down in the 1st century, right after that destruction when the beast and his armies were thrown alive into the lake of fire, when that volcano erupted over Rome. So if you consider all of this history and correlate it with the prophecies of Revelation 13, it makes a powerful case of how Rome could have been the fulfillment of the symbols of Revelation 13. And given that John is making a prophecy of events that are about to take place, and he's communicating in symbolic language, in apocalyptic language, and he's continuing the tradition of Daniel, and just as Daniel talked about ancient empires represented by beast, we know that John is doing the same in Revelation. It's pretty easy to identify this as Rome, 1st century Rome, and it's built on 7 hills, and it has 7 emperors with an 8th to follow. And so I believe all the symbolism lines up very nicely with Rome. And I'm not the only one to think so. There's a lot of partial and full preterists who agree with me on this subject. And so, yeah, I would encourage you to check out their work too. There's some who believe that this represents a Jewish entity, and so that's worth considering, and I'd encourage you again to do your own research on that. But this is the view I feel is most compelling. Rome had blasphemous names on their heads. They called themselves gods. They demanded people worship them and their idols. They resembled the leopard, the bear, the lion, because they adopted the cultures of all these other nations they had conquered. Satan made Rome powerful, and they worshiped Satan and forced people to worship him. Nero wounded himself in the head fatally, and that caused a dark and civil war. But then Rome rose from the ashes again, and they were revived. And then that's represented when Titus and Vespasian came and restored peace to Rome. The world couldn't conquer Rome. It was undefeatable in its time. And it warred against the saints for 42 months during that Neronic persecution from 64 to mid-68 AD. It was given authority over every tribe and people and nation. So if you've enjoyed these series, let me know. And this is really cool. We've hopefully identified the sea beast. And in the next video, we'll be discussing the 10 horns of the sea beast. The sea beast had 10 horns, and who were these 10 horns? So I hope you've appreciated the content, and I hope you've enjoyed it and been edified. As with everything, pray and research the things I say. I might be wrong on some of these subjects and I don't want to mislead you. So I encourage you to take this as a starting point and continue to study. I hope you have a good day. Thank you.